Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG podcast. I'm Ramon Mejia. I'm here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course, author interviews. And this week we'll be talking about reviewing Soulblade, the Genesis Gate Stage 1, Book 1. Also, the book Mundis Mori. And after that, Nigmus Online. And then after that, The Thousand Years War, the Trilogy. 4 books of a pretty decent length each. So even though it's not a ton of books, word count wise or page wise count, pretty good. But we're going to move on to our first section, which is LitRPG news. And in LitRPG news, we begin with the story from Michael Chatfield, author of one of the stories that we'll be reviewing this week. He was nice enough to send the podcast an email saying that the release date of his next story, Stone Raiders Return, is going to be out on June the 6th. That's going to be book 6 in the Amarillo series. Additionally, his first book in the series, The Trap Mind Project, will be out in audiobook format in May. So, yay. Good for him. He also says he hopes everyone has a great week. Okay, next story. Luke Chimilenko, author of the Ascend Online series, was nice enough to give everybody a nice sneak preview of the cover of his latest book, Hell to Pay. It's going to be out on May the 1st, and the cover looks pretty darn fancy. He definitely a huge upgrade from the original cover, which was very indie. For book 1 in this series, and he's also actually going to get that cover redone as well. He found an amazing artist to do this work, and I gotta say, I'm looking at it and I'm kind of drooling over the cover art. So it's a good. I look forward to reading the book on May 1st when it comes out, in only a couple days. Okay, last bit of news is from R.A. Mejia. That's me. For those of you who don't know, I wrote a story called Adventures on Terra Beginnings under the pen name R.A. Mejia. I know, not that original. And it was really successful when it came out to the end of 2016. And it was such a huge success that I had a bunch of authors telling me that I could actually, make a living at writing if I could keep those numbers. And it is now April of this month, and I'm kind of taking the leap into that realm. The news portion of this is this. I started a Patreon for the writer portion of my life, R.A. Mejia. It's at patreon.com/R.A. Mejia Writer. If you want to go check it out. But the huger news is that I am actually going to quit my day job and be a full-time writer and podcaster. And it's a huge, amazingly huge and scary, risky move. And I know it. I'm giving up a steady paycheck every month, and healthcare, essentially to kind of do this writing thing that may or may not be successful. And if I'm being honest, it's really rather frightening to take this huge risk. But for me, I had to come to the realization that I'd rather take the risk and fail than kind of live my life wondering what could have been. And so that's kind of the news on my end. And I want to let you guys know about it because you have been such great supporters that I couldn't even imagine making this step in my life without you guys and letting you guys know and thanking you for your support. So if you want to help support the writing portion, just in between books, basically, you can go to patreon.com/again, R.A. Mejia Writer. We have a ton of great rewards for people who want to support the writing of those novels, of those LitRPG novels, including thank you messages from, story characters, early access to cover art, bonus art projects, of course, early access to the rough drafts of the story if you just jones in for the next, chapter in that series. And of course, author chats, early downloads of novels and audiobook versions of the book, and a ton of other stuff. Go check it out. Thank you though for just being supportive listeners and readers. And that's it for the LitRPG news section. A few more notes. A few new audiobooks in LitRPG. We have World Seed, Game Start, Book 1. We also have the story Ring of Promise. And then Corpse Run, which is the 3rd book in the Crucible Short series, all out on audiobook. So go check those out. And these stories are actually out now currently, but I didn't finish them in time to review them for this podcast. But I'll be checking them out next week and giving you 4 reviews. And that includes This Is Our Land, which is Amarillia Book 5. So we're not reviewing it. I just happen to remember that it came out this week. And also The Lost Archive, a LitRPG adventure, which actually should be coming out on April the 28th, the day that this actually comes out for most of you. Okay, now upcoming LitRPG, we'll have a ton of stories coming out at May and June, including Ascend Online, Hell to Pay, out on May 1st. Gank, a LitRPG adventure, which is the 4th book in the Crucible Short series, out May the 3rd. May the 9th, you will get The First Player. May the 27th, Stuck in an RPG. And on May the 31st, The Eternal Dragonborn. That's going to be book 2 in the game series. And then on June the 1st, The Hero of Thera. On June the 1st as well, it'll be Conquest, a LitRPG story. On the 2nd of June, it'll be Fantasy Online, Hyperborea. And also on June the 2nd, it'll be Stay on the Wing, which is Dark Obelisk book 2. June the 6th, The Stone Raiders Return, which you just talked about. And there you go. That's kind of it for now. A lot of loose spots in the schedule for LitRPG releases, so be aware of that. And enjoy it while we have so many great stories coming out. On to new releases and reviews, though. Okay, on to new releases and reviews, folks. First review in the story slot schedule thing. Sorry, I'm still kind of jittery about the other thing I talked about. But is Soulblade, the Genesis Gates Stage 1, Book 1, written by Patty Larson. It is about 200 pages. Again, the actual page count isn't on Amazon as of this recording. It is $3.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Again, written by Patty Larson, who's written dozens and dozens and dozens of books. If you look up on Amazon, there's a lot of books there, mostly in like the teen paranormal fantasy mystery genres. This is her first foray into LitRPG. Okay, summary of the story premise. Web G wakes up in a cell and finds himself imprisoned with a group of fantasy characters. They all seem to have the goal of finding a mysterious object called a Soulblade to stop the Demon King from ruling the land. Only our main character, Web, doesn't remember anything about his past, but has a strange set of symbols and numbers tattooed on his arm that he calls an embed. Can the group make their way through the maze of a prison and survive to find the Soulblade and stop the Demon King? So there you go. Now here's essentially the review. This story is mostly fantasy with like a drip drop of LitRPG. If I was going to give a percentage wise, that's a 2% LitRPG, 98% fantasy story. Like Escape from Prison fantasy story with mazes and puzzles and things like that. And very early in the story, the main character references the embed, which is kind of the only game mechanic that you see within the storyline. And I'm assuming it's a type of character sheet with a health counter on there. There are a bunch of abbreviations like PH, ME, SP, EM, HW, BL, and FH. And each has associated numbers. And I kind of think that if the numbers are high enough, feats of strength or will or belief are accomplished along the way. Also, armor, weapons give bonuses to these stats, but apparently not defense or attack bonuses. At least that's kind of what I think. And I say that because that's part of the problem with the story is that these game mechanics, even the ones that are revealed in the story, aren't explained. They're mostly hidden away. And not as much as they would be in just a straight fantasy story, but not much more than that. I mean, most of the things in as far as the game mechanics go, are not explained. We're just kind of given these letters and numbers. And as somebody who's done role-playing games before, I can kind of see, oh, this is maybe a save roll, or maybe this is like a feat roll, or if they have this particular stat, they can pass through this, particular puzzle or do this thing. But again, that's kind of the extent of it. And even that portion of it's not explained other than maybe defining what those abbreviations are occasionally. Most of the story really does read to me as like straight fantasy. And only in the very last few pages of the story is it revealed that this story is part of some type of game and that this is one of many levels in this virtual game, possibly. And again, it's not really explained too much. And I personally had a really hard time deciding whether this was going to be LitRPG or not, because there was like possibly, if I stretched even my basic definition of LitRPG to the extreme, that it might be. But in actuality, when I was reading it, it really just felt like a fantasy story. And from the author's notes at the very end of the novel, I kind of felt like she made an honest effort at writing LitRPG, but didn't want to alienate her vast current reader base by making it too gamey and kind of hiding those game mechanics. But what really decided for me was the fact that when I actually counted the number of times any game mechanic was referenced, it was very small compared to the rest of the story. The most common word being the word embed, which is that character sheet thing. And I counted them, and that word only appears in the context of game mechanics about 30 times in the entire story. And even if you're extrapolating 30 times to the rest of those stats we mentioned as well, that only means there's around 200 words of any kind that refer to a game mechanic in the story. That's out of hundreds of pages, tens of thousands of words. So it's a very small percentage of game mechanic stuff, which is kind of an important part of LitRPG, the RPG portion of LitRPG. And so for me, I could actually remove all those words, and it would really almost be an identical story without the game mechanic stuff. And if I can do that in your story, it's probably not LitRPG. And so for that reason, I didn't really have a good time. And overall, even as I was reading it, it never really satisfied that itch for LitRPG, in my opinion. So for those reasons, it's going to get a 4 out of 10 for me. Overall, it's not a bad story. It's really well developed, good characters, all the good stuff, but that's fantasy story stuff and not LitRPG stuff. So as a fantasy story, it would get a better score, 6, maybe a 7 out of 10. But as LitRPG, it just didn't satisfy. So it gets a 4 out of 10. Okay, on to our next story, Mundis Mori, a LitRPG adventure written by Justin Koch. It is 263 pages. It is $3.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. I will read you the author's description of the story. Hay's life sucks. Hard. But playing Mundis doesn't. All he wants in the whole wide world is to ride his demon steed. On his way to get his steed, naked and helpless, he is betrayed and left for dead at the bottom of the black hole of Calcutta. He swears to destroy his betrayer, and using the last of his meager savings, he hires the Thrill Kill cult to help him. The closer they get to revenge, the stranger things get, until his virtual vendetta leads to real blood. Okay. This was a very interesting story. And not all of it takes place. Actually, the majority of it doesn't take place within the game world. But the first third of it absolutely does. It really does jump into the game world very quickly within the storyline, and it stays there for a good portion of the story. So that kind of satisfied my LitRPG need within this context of the story. And the first of the story really is about the lengths of one player, Halfhar Hogo, to get his digital revenge on a ganker. There's no player versus environment in this entire section. It's all player versus player stuff. And the story is more about player behavior and some of the crazy things that motivated players will do in game. And about every level of the story, I can actually recall personal experiences where I was like, oh yeah, that's happened to me. I've been killed. I've killed others in game in like MMOs. And I've had guys spawn camp me and just kill me repeatedly for laughs, basically. And especially games like that are full player versus player games like Shadowbane or other games like that. So I could relate definitely to this portion of the story. But at about the 33% mark of the story, it leaves that game world entirely. And for the rest of the story, which is another 40% of the story, they're in the real world. There are this group of people who have been trying to take revenge on this ganker character. Bad things happen, and this group has to figure out how to deal with the real life consequences of what they kind of stumbled on in the story. And I don't want to get too spoilery, but essentially in the story, in the game world, they stumble on some real world crimes that are kind of taking place within the game, and the game is almost an accessory to it. And when the bad guys find out, they track them out in real life and, try to kill them. And so they have to go on the run. And it kind of really reminded me of remember the section in Ready Player One where all those friends had to leave the game and go on the run. That's what this is for like 40% of the story. And then of course deal with the bad guys in real life and figure out how to deal with that. And that's the last, half of that story. And that portion is about, the four friends, meeting in real life, becoming friends, dealing with the bad guys. And it really was an interesting story, even outside of the game. You got a lot of, again, personalities, behavioral aspects of players, what happens when you meet your online friends in real life, that kind of stuff. And it was entertaining. I also have to warn you, though, of course, the last 25% of the story, which is kind of a weird thing, is actually not story. It is, it's not the author's story. It's someone else's story that he's kind of plugging. And also a very, very large footnote section, like literally 20% of the story is footnote references that are spread out throughout the book. And they're funny and they're interesting footnotes, but it's a good portion of your overall page count. I'm just saying. But for me, had an entertaining time. It gets a 7 out of 10. Okay, on to Nigmus Online, written by Noah Barnett. Okay, here is the story summary. Liam is tricked into trying an expensive and innovative online MMO. On his first trip into the game, he stumbles upon a hidden class, the Undead Necromancer. Intrigued by this turn of events, he continues to explore this mysterious world. In another part of the country, Catherine, Cat, suffers from a debilitating and paralyzing disease. Taking part in an experimental research could offer her a new lease on life, of a sort. Even further afield, Russia and China are undergoing a massive spike in suicide rates. What could be causing so many young adults to dire ends? That's the author's phrasing. Okay, that's basically the summary story from the author. My opinion, this is going to run you about 400 pages. Again, no official Amazon page count. It is $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited, so really nice price point for the page count. Good value for your buck. And reading the first few pages of the story set my expectations pretty high. I mean, within the first few pages, there are zombies, which is cool. There are players fighting gun-wielding dwarves, also cool. There's a little bit of romance between the unholy paladin and the necromancer. Sweet. But unfortunately, a lot of those expectations were probably too high, and that detracted a little bit from my enjoyment of the story. And it doesn't really get super great again until like the 60% mark within the story, unfortunately. And again, this is not to say that first 60% is bad. It's just, not as good as I was hoping from the expectations that were raised at the very, very beginning of the story. And there are things that I liked about the story. There are things that I wish I could have seen more of. Some of the things that I really did enjoy. There are really cool moments in the story. There are a lot of cool instances. And the premises are very cool and interesting. And there's a slew of really interesting classes like Necromancer, Reaver, Unholy Paladin, more. A bunch of undead class-related stuff. I mean, even later on in the story, there's guild versus guild battles, some kingdom building, some crafting for those of you guys who like that kind of stuff. But a lot of that happens very late in the story. And again, the relationships between characters within the story are very well developed. I could feel for the Liam and for Kat, and for some of the side characters, I got a sense of who they were, how they were interacting, and that was really well done, especially, the budding romance between the two main characters. The villains in the story are very villainous. You can't ever hear without a good villain, and these villains are ones you are okay hating and not liking at all, and they all get their comeuppance in the very end, by the end of the story, so it's very satisfying. But some of the things that I didn't like of the story kind of detracted from those points. For example, there's not really a lot of game detail. I should say not as much as are in other LitRPG stories. For example, the main character Liam goes from level 1 to level 7 to level 10 to level 20 with only like small snippets of story in between those levels. There's no like detailed leveling map from 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It really does skip between story around level 1, time skip, 2 weeks ahead. I'm level 7 now as Liam the Necromancer. And to me, those little bits in between levels are the things that I love learning about the most. The grinding, what monsters he chooses, tactics he chooses to level up, how his powers evolve, how to learn strategy, all that stuff. And that's missing from the first half of the story, essentially. It really does focus around the main characters essentially getting other classes, getting together, forming a party, other players' reactions to them. And that's okay. I mean, it's not bad writing. It's just, I saw so many little opportunities for stories and for advancement. Almost at every page turn, someone's like, that would be a great story by itself, or I wish you would have expanded on that, or I wish I would learn more about the escape mechanic that you're kind of casually mentioning. And, so that kind of detracted a little bit from me, especially with Kat. I mean, she literally goes through a race change from being a human to being undead. And you get the Cliff Notes version of it in the story. It's like, oh, I did this thing and had this quest and bam, done. Instead of it being like this, chapter of myself, which it very well could have been. And I understand it's the author's right to write whatever story he wants. But it's just, I'm like, that would have been a great story by itself. And so that kind of took away a little bit from me. And again, another thing that the story probably suffers from is comparison. This is a necromancer story in LitRPG, and so it's always going to be compared to like the big necromancer story in our genre, which is going to be Awaken Online. And by comparison, this one suffers, unfortunately, because that story got 8 out of 10 and a 9 out of 10 for me with a subsequent book for Awaken Online. And I couldn't help but compare it in my brain because they're both necromancer main characters. And this story is definitely not as detailed in the game mechanics. And that was unfortunate that I couldn't help but compare them in my brain. And so while I had a really good time reading it, it was very nice. It was not amazing, unfortunately. So it gets a score of 6 out of 10. So there you go. Not bad. It's not bad at all. It's just not amazing. But it is from the Railroad. So if you read the story on Railroad and you just want to go support the author, I really do encourage you to do so. Okay. On to our last review, The 1,000 Years War, the Trilogy. It is written by Angel Ramon. He shares a name with me, so I wanted to like this so much. Really, I did. Here's the premise for the first book in the series. 4 Joes, Angel, Devon, Maria, and Luis, are introduced to a virtual world where anything that happens inside happens on Earth. An alien race looks to take advantage of the situation to capture Earth from under mankind's nose. The 4 chosen ones only have 10 days to reverse the effects that have been done or risk living in a world invaded by aliens and being in their debt. It is $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. I put the link for the trilogy in case you want to read it. Might as well get it one shot. It's not that expensive, $4.99. The author has it on sale. I believe the first couple books for like 99 cents. So it's not, as far as like value for buck, not bad. But the author also did advertise it as LitRPG on the LitRPG Facebook groups. And so for that reason, I read it and I took a chance, and I was sorely disappointed by its lack of LitRPG content or even video game content. There were also some story issues as far as like writing goes, grammar, spelling. And that was also an issue for me. But the bigger issue, of course, is that it's not LitRPG. As far as the story premise goes, it's 4 chosen people are chosen by the good god on Earth to fight against the bad god, who has created an alternate version of Earth to try and conquer it. But our 4 heroes are sent in that world, and they have to face a bunch of monsters and shoot them and kill them. And that's kind of the limit of the video game mechanics, in that it's a virtual Earth, and the things they do there might translate to Earth later on. There's a bunch of shooting, and the author in the description says that he thinks that it has a Duke Nukem vibe, and I'll agree. It does, in the sense that it's a bunch of random shooting of monsters and wisecracks. That's fine. But as LitRPG, you should probably have some game mechanics in there somewhere, and talk about them. And that's not happening here at all. And so for me, that's a really big issue. And again, the author has commented on Facebook that he was told that his stories were LitRPG from his readers, but unfortunately, he never actually looked into what LitRPG was himself. So it's a very understandable what he did, I guess. But to me, it felt like he was rebranding his story that he wrote last year as LitRPG for sales, and that seems not okay. But again, I'll give the guy the benefit of the doubt, and I hope he writes actual LitRPG stories in our genre because I like reading them. But this story is just not it. For me, it gets a score of 2 out of 10. Sorry. And that's it. Done. Finished. I know. Short. Thank you for watching and listening, everybody. You can follow us, of course, on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon. We have, I guess, 2 Patreons now. One for the podcast, one for writer Ramon. Go check it out. And of course, you can find all the ways you can support the podcast at litrpgpodcast.com/support. And for me, as soon as I'm done hitting record on this and editing, I'm going to go send a resignation letter to work, which will not be my work anymore. So that's exciting and scary. But thank you very much for listening and for watching the podcast and listening to me talk about the thing that I love, LitRPG. And then again, thank you for your support. For those of you who support the podcast and me as a writer in so many ways. Until we can hang out again, folks, though, remember to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye, everybody.